My client, James, was a lawyer. He was 39 years old. He had a successful career, a beautiful wife, and a 4-month-old baby boy. But he couldn't touch that baby. Not once. He couldn't change a diaper. He couldn't hold him. He couldn't give him a bath. His wife begged him. She said, "This child is yours too, James." But every night, James woke up from the same nightmare. He saw hands reaching toward his son, and those hands were his own. He would wake up screaming. When he came to me, I asked him a simple question. "Why are you so afraid of touching your own child?" His answer stayed with me for years. "My father was a child molester," he said, "and I don't remember anything before the age of 8, not a single thing." James didn't know if his father had done the same things to him, but his mind had erased 8 years. And a mind doesn't erase without reason. In some sessions, my patients healed as they talked, but some stories never left my mind. Today, I'm gonna tell you one of those stories. If you're listening to this and there are things you've been holding inside, share what you're going through in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment, I hear every story. If you want to stay updated on the therapy stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If this story touches you, you can support me by liking it. One day I'd love to hear your story too. If you want me to share your story in my next video, you can send it to the email in my profile. Remember, our stories heal, even just a little, when we share them. I've been a psychologist for 22 years. I've sat across from hundreds of patients in this chair. I've heard confessions that would break most people. But James was different, because he didn't come to remember. He came to make sure he never would. What you're about to hear is not an easy story. It's a story about betrayal at the deepest level. A story about a mother who saw the unspeakable and chose to look away. A story about a man who spent 30 years running from a truth his own body refused to forget. You will hear about a phone call that changed everything. A childhood friend who carried a secret for decades. A confrontation that had been waiting 23 years to happen. And a father who discovered that the thing he feared most about himself was both true and false at the same time. The first time he walked into my office, I noticed something immediately. His suit was perfectly pressed. His tie was immaculate, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled slightly, and he kept them hidden in his pockets. When he finally sat down, he didn't look at me. He looked at the window, as if he was calculating the distance to an exit. In my experience, when a patient avoids eye contact while simultaneously presenting a controlled exterior, they're often engaged in a battle between what they want to reveal and what they're terrified to acknowledge. James's body language told me he was a man who had spent decades constructing walls, professional success, expensive suits, a prestigious career. All of it was armor, and armor is only worn by those expecting an attack. "I don't know why I'm here," he said. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "My wife made the appointment. She thinks something is wrong with me." I noticed how he said "my wife" rather than her name, creating distance even in language, building walls with words. I waited. In my profession, silence is a tool. Most people can't bear it. They fill it with words they didn't plan to say. But James sat there for nearly 2 minutes without speaking. His jaw tight, his breathing shallow. Whatever he was holding, it was heavy. His left foot tapped against the floor in an irregular rhythm. His eyes kept drifting to the framed degrees on my wall, studying my credentials, perhaps judging whether I was qualified to hear whatever he was about to reveal. "Something is wrong with me," he finally said, "but it's not what she thinks." What James revealed next would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. And it started with a phone call from someone he hadn't spoken to in 27 years. 3 weeks before James came to me, his phone rang at 2 in the morning. The number was unknown. He almost didn't answer. Later, he told me he wished he hadn't. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus, his childhood best friend. They had been inseparable from ages 6 to 12. Then Marcus's family moved away suddenly, without explanation, and James never heard from him again. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said. "I've been in therapy for 15 years because of what happened in your house, and I can't carry this alone anymore." James told me his chest went cold. His hands started shaking, the same tremor I would later observe in my office. He wanted to hang up. Every instinct told him to hang up, but he didn't. The body often knows what the mind refuses to accept. James's physical reaction, the cold chest, the trembling hands, suggested his nervous system recognized a threat before his conscious mind could process it. This is a hallmark of trauma survivors. The body keeps the score, as we say in my field. It remembers what the mind has locked away. Marcus told him everything. He told him about the weekends James's father invited him to stay over, about the basement, about what happened when everyone else was asleep. And then he said something that shattered James's entire understanding of his childhood. "Your mother walked in once, James. She opened the door. She saw us. She saw what your father was doing. And she closed the door. She just closed it and walked away." James's mother hadn't just ignored what was happening. She had witnessed it, and her silence had protected no one except herself. But the question that would torment James wasn't about Marcus. It was about what else that closed door had hidden. When James finished telling me about the phone call, he was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His breathing had become rapid, shallow. I recognized the signs of acute anxiety, the beginning stages of what could become a panic attack. "James," I said softly, "I need you to breathe. Can you do that for me? Just breathe." He nodded, but his eyes had gone distant. He wasn't in my office anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. "I keep trying to remember," he said. "I've been trying for 3 weeks. I look at old photos, I drive by the house we used to live in. I even found my old bedroom in my mind, the wallpaper, the bed, the window. But everything before age 8 is just black, like someone erased it." What James was describing is called dissociative amnesia. It's a protective mechanism the brain employs when trauma is too overwhelming for a child to process. The memories don't disappear. They become inaccessible, locked behind a door the mind builds to protect itself. But that door isn't soundproof. The emotions, the physical sensations, the terror, they leak through. They manifest as nightmares, as anxiety, as an inexplicable fear of touching your own child. Over the next several sessions, I learned more about James's family. His father, Dr. Richard Hartley, had been a respected surgeon, the kind of man who received awards at charity galas, who sat on hospital boards, whose handshake was sought by politicians and business leaders alike. "Everyone loved him," James said. His voice carried a bitterness that had aged like wine. "The neighbors, the other doctors, even my teachers, they all thought he was this great man, this pillar of the community." "And your mother?" I asked. James's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes, something cold. "My mother loved what he provided. The house, the cars, the country club membership, the reputation." He paused. "She came from nothing, grew up poor, met my father in college. He was already on his way to becoming somebody. She attached herself to that trajectory and never let go." "Tell me more about her background," I said. James leaned back, his expression hardening. "Her father was a drunk who abandoned the family when she was 9. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. My mother grew up watching rich kids through windows, seeing the life she wanted but couldn't have. She swore she would never be poor again, she would never be powerless again. And your father gave her that power. He gave her everything she'd ever wanted, a beautiful home, social status, financial security. In exchange, she gave him loyalty, absolute, unquestioning loyalty, no matter what." James's voice dropped. "I used to think she didn't know. I used to tell myself she couldn't have known. But after what Marcus told me, after what I remembered, I understand now. She knew. She always knew. And she decided that keeping her lifestyle was worth more than protecting her own child." James's mother represents a particularly tragic archetype, the parent who prioritizes security over their child's safety. Her childhood poverty had created such deep wounds that wealth and status became her oxygen. The thought of losing them was more terrifying than facing what her husband was doing. This is not an excuse. It is not forgiveness. But understanding the why behind monstrous choices helps survivors like James make sense of the senseless. It removes the torturous question of, why wasn't I enough to protect? The answer had nothing to do with James's worth. It had everything to do with his mother's wounds. James's mother wasn't just complicit in her silence, she had built her entire identity around the status her husband provided, and when protecting that status meant closing a door on her own son, she had made her choice. I was 12 when the police came, James continued. His voice had dropped, become almost mechanical. I was at school. They pulled me out of class. Everyone saw. Everyone watched me walk down the hallway with 2 officers. He swallowed hard. They didn't tell me what happened. They just asked questions. Did I know Marcus? Did Marcus ever stay at our house? Did anything ever happen that made me uncomfortable? What did you say? I said no to everything because I didn't remember anything, and because I wanted my father to come home, because I wanted to believe none of it was true. He stopped. His eyes grew wet, but no tears fell. Because I wanted my father to come home. I didn't understand what he'd done. I just wanted everything to go back to normal. A 12-year-old's loyalty to a parent, even an abusive one, is a survival mechanism. Children are hardwired to attach to their caregivers. It's not a choice. It's biology. James's denial wasn't just about not remembering. It was about protecting the only version of his family he could bear to acknowledge. The alternative, that his father was a monster and his mother had known, was too devastating for a child's psyche to accept. What happened to your father? I asked. He went to prison. 8 years. Computer forensics found hundreds of images on his work computer. The hospital fired him immediately. His medical license was revoked. Marcus's family had already moved away by then, but they came back to testify. James exhaled slowly. I wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but I heard things from other kids at school, from their parents whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. And your mother? Something dark passed across James's face. She stayed. She visited him in prison every month. She told everyone he was innocent, that it was a setup, that the hospital was jealous of his success. His voice cracked slightly. And she blamed me. James's mother hadn't just failed to protect him, she had turned him into the villain of her own narrative, and what she accused him of would haunt him for decades. Blamed you? I leaned forward slightly. For what? James's hands moved to his lap, fingers intertwining, knuckles pressing against each other. She said I must have said something. To a teacher, to Marcus's parents, she said I ruined our family. That if I had just kept quiet, none of it would have happened. His voice broke on the last word. I was 12 years old, and she told me I destroyed everything. I let the silence hold for a moment. Sometimes the most therapeutic thing a person can do is hear their own words hang in the air, uninterrupted by analysis or comfort. I didn't even know what I had said, James continued. I still don't. Maybe I mentioned something at school without realizing it. Maybe I drew something. I don't know. But she decided it was my fault, and she never let me forget it. What James experienced from his mother is called secondary victimization. When the people who should protect us instead blame us for our own trauma, the damage compounds. James wasn't just carrying the weight of potential abuse, he was carrying the guilt his mother had placed on him. Guilt for exposing the truth. Guilt for being the catalyst, even unknowingly, of his family's destruction. This is a burden no child should ever bear. When did she tell you to leave? I asked. James looked surprised. How did you know? Because you're sitting here, James. Because you built a career, a family, a life completely separate from her. People don't do that unless there's a severance, a moment when the door closes for good. He nodded slowly. I was 16. My father had been in prison for 4 years. She was drinking more. The money was running out. And one night, she looked at me across the dinner table and said, I can't look at you anymore. You have his eyes. James's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She kicked me out the next morning. I went to live with my aunt, my mother's sister who she hadn't spoken to in years. She was the only person who offered. Tell me about your aunt, I said. James's expression softened slightly. Aunt Ruth. She was everything my mother wasn't. She worked as a librarian. Small apartment, modest life, never married. My mother always looked down on her for that, called her a spinster behind her back. He paused, and something like gratitude crossed his face. But Ruth took me in without a single question. She cleared out her study, bought me a bed from a thrift store, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. Did she know what had happened with your father? Everyone knew. It was in the papers. The respected surgeon, the pillar of the community, arrested for crimes against children. You can imagine the headlines. James's jaw tightened. Ruth never asked me about it. Not once. She just made sure I ate dinner, did my homework, and got to school on time. She treated me like a normal teenager, not like a victim or a criminal's son. I didn't realize how much I needed that until years later. What James's aunt provided was what we call a secure base. In the wreckage of his family, she offered stability without interrogation, presence without pressure. For a traumatized teenager, this kind of unconditional acceptance can be transformative. Ruth didn't try to fix James or force him to process what had happened. She simply created a space where he could exist without judgment. Sometimes, that's exactly what a wounded child needs most. I threw myself into school, James continued. Every night, I studied until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I told myself if I got perfect grades, if I got into a good college, if I became successful, then maybe I could outrun it. Maybe I could become someone other than Richard Hartley's son. Did it work? A bitter smile crossed his face. I got a full scholarship to law school, graduated top of my class, and have made partner at my firm by 35. By every external measure, I succeeded. The smile faded, but you can't outrun something that lives inside you. I learned that the hard way. James had survived abandonment by both parents, one through imprisonment, one through rejection. But the deepest wound was still buried, and it would take time before he was ready to unearth it. Our sessions continued for 3 months. James was a difficult patient in some ways. He was guarded, intellectualizing his emotions rather than feeling them. Whenever we approached something painful, he would retreat into legal language, analyzing his trauma as if it were a case he was arguing, rather than a wound he was carrying. During this time, I asked him about his wife. Her name was Elena. They had met in law school, 2 ambitious students competing for the same internship. She had won, and instead of resenting her, James had found himself captivated. She was the first person who saw through me, James said. Everyone else bought the act, the confident lawyer, the guy who had it all together. But Elena looked at me once across a study group and said, "You're exhausted, aren't you? Not just tired, exhausted in your bones." Nobody had ever seen that before. Did you tell her about your past? Pieces of it. I told her my father was in prison. I told her my mother and I were estranged. I never told her why. His voice tightened. She asked once, early in our relationship. I shut down so completely that she never asked again. She learned to navigate around the locked rooms in my head. James had constructed what we call a functional facade. To the outside world and even to his wife, he appeared successful and stable. But Elena's intuition had sensed the exhaustion beneath. Partners of trauma survivors often develop this awareness. They learn to read the silences, the sudden withdrawals, the topics that must never be touched. It creates a strange intimacy, knowing someone deeply while being locked out of their deepest pain. "How is your marriage now?" I asked. With everything that's happening, James exhaled heavily. Hanging by a thread. Elena is patient, but she's not a saint. She carried the pregnancy mostly alone because I was too anxious to touch her belly. She went through labor while I sat in the waiting room, unable to be in the delivery room because I was terrified of what I might feel when I saw my son for the first time. His voice cracked. She has spent 4 months being both mother and father to our child, while I stand in doorways like a ghost. Has she threatened to leave? Not with words, but I see it in her eyes sometimes. The exhaustion, the loneliness. She married a man, not a monument to damage. James looked at his hands. Last week, she said something that broke me. She said, "I can't keep loving you for both of us. At some point you have to choose to be here." And she's right. I know she's right. But the nightmares were getting worse. He told me he had started sleeping in his car some nights, parked in the driveway, because he was afraid of what he might do if he stayed in the house with his son. I would never hurt him, James insisted, his voice cracking. I know I wouldn't, but these thoughts, these images, they come into my head and I can't stop them. I see myself doing things, horrible things, and I don't know if they're fears or if they're memories trying to break through. What James was describing are intrusive thoughts, a symptom common in both OCD and PTSD. These thoughts are not desires or intentions. They're the mind's way of processing fear. James's terror of becoming his father was so profound that his brain was generating worst-case scenarios on repeat. The cruelty of intrusive thoughts is that they target what we love most. James loved a son. That's precisely why his mind tortured him with images of harming him. "James," I said carefully, "I think there's something your mind is trying to tell you. And that's something it's been trying to tell you for a very long time, but you've been so afraid of the answer that you've kept it locked away." He went very still. His breathing slowed. I could see the muscles in his jaw working, grinding. "I'm not ready," he said. "I know," I replied, "but I don't think your mind is giving you a choice anymore. The nightmares, the intrusive thoughts, the inability to touch your son, these are all signals. Your psyche is demanding to be heard." James had spent 27 years building walls around whatever happened before he turned 8. But walls don't hold forever, and what was behind his was about to break through. It happened in our 14th session. I had suggested we try a guided visualization technique, something gentle, where I would lead him back through memories of his childhood, starting from the safest ones and slowly moving backward. "I want you to close your eyes," I told him. "Focus on your breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. When you're ready, I want you to imagine yourself walking down a long hallway. On either side of you are doors. Each door leads to a different memory. We're going to open them one at a time, starting with the ones that feel safe." James closed his eyes. His breathing was uneven at first, but gradually it steadied. I watched his face for signs of distress, ready to pull him back at any moment. We started with high school, his aunt's house. The small bedroom with the slanted ceiling where he had studied every night, determined to escape into a better life. He smiled faintly at this memory. His aunt had been kind, he said. Strict, but kind. "I can smell her cooking," James murmured. "She made this chicken casserole every Sunday. I hated it first, but eventually it became comfort food, the smell of home." His smile faded slightly. "The first real home I ever had." We moved to middle school, the years after his father's arrest, the whispers in the hallway, the friends who stopped calling, the loneliness that became his constant companion. There was one teacher, James said, Mr. Patterson. English class. He never treated me differently. When the other kids looked at me like I was contaminated, he just talked to me about books. He recommended novels about characters who overcame terrible circumstances. I think he knew. He never said anything, but I think he knew. Then I asked him to go further. To age 10, to age 9, to 8. His breathing changed. It became rapid, shallow, like a cornered animal. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. Sweat appeared on his forehead. "I see the basement," he whispered. "The one at our old house. There's a door. It's brown, wooden. I don't want to go through it." "You don't have to," I said softly, "but I'm here with you. You're safe. You're in my office. You're 39 years old. Whatever is behind that door can't hurt you anymore." James's face contorted. A sound escaped him, something between a sob and a moan. "I'm small," he said. "I'm so small. And the door is opening. He's calling my name. I can hear his voice." What I was witnessing was the beginning of a trauma memory surfacing. These memories don't return like normal recollections. They come with the full emotional and physical weight of the original experience. James wasn't just remembering being called to the basement. He was reliving it. His body was responding as if it were happening right now, in this moment. This is the nature of traumatic memory. It exists outside of normal time. "James, I want you to stay with me," I said. "Can you hear my voice? I need you to describe what you see. Only what you see. Can you do that?" His eyes were closed, tears streaming down his cheeks. "There's a mattress," he said, "on the floor. Old, stained, and there's someone else. Another boy. I think it's Marcus." Yes, it's Marcus. Marcus hadn't been alone in that basement, and the memories James had buried for nearly 3 decades were finally clawing their way to the surface. "My father is there." James continued, his voice high and thin, a child's voice trapped in a man's body. "He's smiling. He says it's okay. He says it's our special time. He says Mom knows about it." James's face crumpled. "He says Mom knows. He says she said it's fine. He says this is what fathers and sons do." I felt my own chest tighten. 22 years and there are still moments that test my professional composure. This was one of them. James, I said gently, I need to ask you something important. In this memory, what is happening to you? A long silence. His body was trembling now, small shudders running through him like aftershocks of an earthquake. The same thing, he finally said. The same thing that's happening to Marcus. We're both there, together, both of us. His eyes opened, red-rimmed, devastated. He did it to me too. I didn't imagine it. I didn't make it up. He did it to me too. The moment of recovered memory is never triumphant. There is no relief in confirming your worst fears. And what James was experiencing was a profound grief. Mourning for the childhood that was stolen from him. Mourning for the innocence he never got to keep. And beneath that grief was rage. Rage at his father. Rage at his mother. And most complicated of all, rage at himself for not remembering sooner. For not being able to stop it. For surviving when part of him wished he hadn't. The weeks following James's breakthrough were some of the most difficult of his therapy. The memories didn't come all at once. They leaked in slowly, painfully, like water through a cracked dam. Some nights he would call me in crisis, fragments of the past flooding back without warning. One night he called me at 3 a.m. His voice was barely recognizable. I remembered something else, he said. I remembered what my bedroom smelled like. Pine. There was a pine air freshener hanging from my ceiling fan. I bought it myself from a dollar store because I wanted my room to smell like the forest, like somewhere safe. He broke down. I was 6 years old, and I was trying to make my bedroom smell like somewhere far away from that house. Another memory surfaced during a session. James was mid-sentence when he suddenly stopped. His face went pale. There was a red blanket, he whispered. In the basement. He would put it on the mattress and tell me it was special. Just for us. I haven't been able to look at the color red without feeling sick for 30 years, and I never knew why until right now. This is the nature of recovered memory. It rarely returns as a complete narrative. Instead, it surfaces in fragments. A smell, a color, a texture. The brain stores traumatic memories differently than ordinary ones. They become encoded in the sensory system, which is why a trauma survivor might have a panic attack from a particular scent without understanding why. James was experiencing the slow, painful reassembly of his stolen childhood, one sensory detail at a time. Elena, to her credit, stood by him through this period. James told me she had started sleeping in the nursery some nights, giving him space while still being close to their son. She brought him food when he forgot to eat. She didn't ask questions he couldn't answer. She found me crying in the shower last week. James said quietly. I was sitting on the floor with the water running cold, and I couldn't move. She just climbed in with me, clothes and all, and held me. She didn't say anything. She just held me until the shaking stopped. But something else was emerging alongside the pain. Anger. A righteous, burning anger that had been suppressed for decades. I want to talk to her, James said one session. His voice was different now, harder. The trembling hands had been replaced by clenched fists. My mother. I need to look her in the eye and ask her why. Why what? I asked, though I already knew. Why she chose him. Why she closed that door. Why she threw me out instead of protecting me. His jaw tightened. Why she let me spend 27 years thinking I might be just like him. James's mother was now 71 years old. His father had died in prison 6 years ago. But some accounts don't close with death. Some require the living to settle them. I discussed the risks with James extensively. Confronting an abuser or an enabler doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it deepens wounds. Sometimes the person denies everything. Sometimes they turn the blame back on the victim. I needed James to be prepared for any outcome. I don't need her to apologize, James said. I don't need her to admit anything. I just need her to know, that I remember, that she didn't get away with it. What James was describing is a need for what we call witness. Trauma survivors often carry their stories in isolation, wondering if anyone will ever truly understand what happened to them. Confronting the person who failed to protect them isn't always about getting an apology. It's about breaking the silence. It's about saying, I exist, this happened, and you cannot pretend otherwise. For James, this confrontation was about reclaiming his narrative. James drove to his mother's house on a Tuesday afternoon. She still lived in the same town, a smaller house now, after all the money had dried up. He called me from his car before going in. "I don't know if I can do this," he said. "You don't have to," I reminded him. "This is your choice. You can turn around right now, and that would be okay." A long pause. Then, "No. I've been turning around my whole life, not today." He told me about the conversation later that week. His mother had opened the door looking older than he expected, smaller somehow, diminished. She had seemed surprised to see him, then guarded. "James," she said, "this isn't a good time." "It's been 23 years, Mother. When exactly would be a good time?" She let him in. They sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs that didn't include him. His father's medical awards still hung on the wall. No pictures of James. Not one. James told me he looked around that room and felt like an archaeologist discovering evidence of a civilization that had existed without him. There were photos of vacations he didn't remember, holidays he wasn't invited to, a life that had continued as if he had never been born. There was a photo on the mantel, he said. My parents at some gala, my mother in a red dress, my father in a tuxedo. They looked happy, genuinely happy. This was after the trial, after he went to prison. She had it framed and displayed like a trophy. His voice hardened. She was proud of standing by him, proud of her loyalty. Even now, James had been erased from his mother's home just as thoroughly as his memories had been erased from his mind. But he wasn't there to be remembered. He was there to make sure she would never forget. "I spoke to Marcus," James told her. 3 months ago, he called me. His mother's face went pale. "I don't know who that is." "Yes, you do. He was my best friend. He stayed at our house almost every weekend for 2 years. And you know exactly what happened to him in our basement." James's voice was steady now. "Because you saw it. You opened the door, you looked at your husband abusing a child, and you closed the door and walked away." His mother stood up abruptly. "You need to leave." "Not yet." James remained seated. "Because there's something else I remember now, something I spent almost 30 years forgetting. I wasn't just a witness, Mother. I wasn't just Marcus's friend who happened to be in the wrong place. I was there too, in that basement, being hurt just like him. And you knew what he was doing to your own son, and you chose him anyway." What James did in that moment required immense courage. He named his truth to the person most invested in denying it. His mother's reaction, attempting to dismiss and flee, is common among enablers. They have constructed entire identities around not knowing, around being innocent bystanders. When that narrative is challenged, their instinct is to attack or escape. James refusing to leave forced her to sit with a reality she had spent decades avoiding. His mother's face went through several expressions: shock, anger, and then something James hadn't expected, a kind of hollow defeat. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Her voice was thin now. "An apology? It won't change anything." "No," James said. "It won't. Nothing will change what happened. But I want you to understand something." He leaned forward. "I have a son now. He's 4 months old. And every single day I look at him and I think about what kind of father I want to be. Not what kind of father mine was, what kind I choose to be." He stood. "You chose your husband. You chose comfort. You chose silence. I'm choosing differently. I'm choosing my son, and I'm choosing to never let him feel what I felt." He walked out without waiting for her response. He told me later that she didn't say goodbye. She didn't follow him to the door. She just sat there, staring at the awards on her wall. James's mother remained in her museum of denial. But James had stepped out of it. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to go home to his son. I wish I could tell you that James walked through his front door that night and immediately held his son. That the confrontation cured him. That trauma works that way. It doesn't. Healing is not a moment. It's a process. It's thousands of small choices made day after day. And for James, those choices started small. The first time he touched his son, really touched him, was 3 weeks after the confrontation. His wife was giving the baby a bath. James was standing in the doorway, watching, keeping his usual distance. But something shifted in him that night. Maybe it was the way his son splashed in the water, giggling. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying fear for so long. Or maybe it was what his son did next. The baby looked up, saw his father standing in the doorway, and reached out his tiny arms, not toward Alina, who had been caring for him every day, toward James, the absent father, the ghost who haunted doorframes. He wanted me, James told me later, his voice breaking. Even though I had never held him, never fed him, never comforted him when he cried, he still wanted me. He didn't know about my father. He didn't know about what I was afraid of. He just saw his dad and reached for him. He walked into the bathroom. His wife looked up, surprised, and without saying anything, James knelt beside the tub and put his hand on his son's back, just rested it there, feeling the warmth of that small body, the life in it. His skin was so soft. James told me the next session, his eyes were wet, but he was smiling. I forgot babies are that soft. I forgot how warm they are. He wiped his face. He looked up at me and just smiled, like he knew, like he was telling me it was okay. Elena didn't say anything. She just put her hand on James's shoulder and let him have that moment. Later she told me she cried silently the entire time. 4 months of waiting, of hoping, of wondering if her husband would ever come back to them. And then he did. He knelt beside that bathtub and came back. What James experienced was a corrective emotional experience. His fear had told him that touch was dangerous, that he was dangerous. But his son's response, that innocent smile, rewrote the narrative. Not every touch leads to harm. Not every father becomes his own father. James was discovering that his hands could comfort rather than hurt. This is how trauma heals, not through forgetting, but through creating new experiences that gradually outweigh the old ones. Over the following months, James made progress in ways both large and small. He learned to change diapers. He learned to give baths. He learned to rock his son to sleep, humming songs he didn't even know he remembered. One afternoon, he called me with something different in his voice, lighter. I held him for 2 hours today, he said. He fell asleep on my chest. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I just felt like his father. The work was not linear. There were setbacks, a nightmare that sent him spiraling, a news story about a similar case that triggered a panic attack in his office, a moment when his son cried and James's first instinct was still to flee rather than comfort. But each setback was followed by recovery, and each recovery was a little faster than the one before. Elena noticed the changes first. He's coming back, she told me during a couple session we had started. The man I married is coming back. I can see him in there again. She reached over and took James's hand. I wasn't sure he was still in there, but he is, and he's fighting his way out. What Elena described is the return of the authentic self. Trauma forces survivors to construct protective identities, versions of themselves that can function despite the pain. But those protective selves are incomplete. They lack spontaneity, vulnerability, joy. As James healed, he was rediscovering the parts of himself he had locked away for protection. The man who could laugh at his son's giggles, the husband who could hold his wife without flinching, the person who could exist in the present without being ambushed by the past. James also began to grieve, not just for himself, but for the family he should have had, for the childhood he deserved, for the relationship with his mother that was now impossible. I keep thinking about what it would have been like, he said one session, if my father had been normal, if my mother had been protective, if I had grown up feeling safe, I would have been a completely different person. He looked at his hands. Sometimes I mourn that person. The James who never had to carry this. The James who could have been happy without having to fight so hard for it. The nightmares didn't disappear entirely. They still came sometimes, less frequently now, less vivid. But when they did, James had new tools. He knew how to ground himself. He knew how to separate the past from the present. He knew that the intrusive thoughts were not predictions, but echoes. I'm not going to be him, James said in one of our final sessions. I know that now. Not because the fear is gone, but because I make a choice every day. Every time I hold my son, I choose to be different, and that choice matters. It's the only thing that matters. I asked him what he wanted his son to know someday. About him, about their family, about the shadows James had walked through. James thought for a long moment before answering. I want him to know that his father fought for him, that before he was even born, his father was fighting battles he couldn't see, trying to become someone worthy of being his dad. His voice steadied. I want him to know that love isn't always easy. Sometimes it requires us to face the darkest parts of ourselves. But it's worth it. He's worth it. And what about the past? Will you tell him about your father? Someday, when he's old enough to understand. I won't pretend it didn't happen, but I also won't let it define our family. He'll know that bad things happened, and that his father chose to be different. That's the legacy I'm leaving him. Not trauma. Choice. He also reached out to Marcus. They met for coffee, two middle-aged men bound by a shared nightmare. James told me about that meeting in detail, as if he needed to process every moment of it. I almost didn't recognize him, James said. In my mind, he was still 11 years old, but the man who walked into that coffee shop was gray at the temples, with lines around his eyes. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. How did it feel to see him? Complicated. He was proof that it all really happened. For years, some part of me hoped maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe my mind had constructed false memories. But seeing Marcus, seeing the same haunted look in his eyes that I see in my own mirror, there was no more pretending. They talked for 4 hours. Marcus told James about his own journey, the decades of therapy, 2 failed marriages, the addiction he battled in his 20s, the son he had given up for adoption because he was terrified of becoming what had been done to him. He made a different choice than me, James said quietly. He chose not to be a father at all. I chose to try and do it differently. I don't know which one of us was braver. What James and Marcus were doing was called mutual witnessing. When 2 survivors share their experiences, something powerful happens. Each becomes a mirror for the other, validating pain that both had been told to hide. Marcus's presence told James, "You are not crazy. This was real. You are not alone." That validation can be more healing than years of therapy, because it comes from someone who truly understands, not from empathy or professional training, but from shared suffering. At the end of their meeting, Marcus reached across the table and took James's hand. It was the first time another man had touched him in kindness since his aunt had hugged him goodbye when he left for college. "I always wondered if you remembered," Marcus said. "I wondered if you were suffering alone like I was. I'm sorry it took me so long to call, but I'm glad I did. I'm glad we're not alone anymore." James told me he cried in his car for 20 minutes after Marcus left, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time in his life, someone else carried half the weight. 2 boys who had been broken in the same basement had found each other again as men. They couldn't undo what was done to them, but they could refuse to let it define them. James completed therapy after 11 months. His marriage survived, stronger than before. His relationship with his son grew into something beautiful, tender, everything he had been afraid he could never have. He never spoke to his mother again. She passed away 2 years after the confrontation, alone in that small house, surrounded by photographs that still didn't include her son. James didn't attend the funeral. He told me he felt guilty about that, but not enough to change his mind. "She made her choices," he said, "and I made mine. I chose to protect my peace. I chose to focus on the family I'm building, not the one that failed me. I don't hate her anymore. I just feel nothing, and maybe that's the healthiest thing I've ever felt about her." Marcus and James stayed in touch. They have dinner together once a month now. 2 survivors who found each other across decades of separation. James told me that Marcus eventually reconnected with the son he had given up for adoption. The young man, now 23, had sought him out. They're building a relationship slowly, carefully. "Marcus told me something last time we met," James said in one of our final sessions. He said, "We didn't just survive. We're living proof that broken people can learn to hold things gently." I think about that a lot, especially when I'm holding my son. I saw James one last time, about a year after our final session. He was at a coffee shop near my office, his son, now almost 2, sitting on his lap. The boy was playing with his father's tie, giggling. James looked up and saw me. He smiled, a real smile, one I had rarely seen during our time together. He didn't wave or call out, he just nodded, once a small acknowledgement between 2 people who had walked through darkness together. Then he turned back to his son and kissed the top of his head. I watched them for a moment longer. The boy grabbed his father's nose and laughed. James pretended to sneeze, exaggerating the sound until his son dissolved into giggles. It was such a simple moment, the kind of moment that happens in coffee shops all over the world, every single day. Fathers playing with their children, nothing remarkable about it. Except that for James it was everything. It was proof that the cycle could be broken, that a man could grow up with a monster for a father and still learn to be gentle, that hands that had been hurt could learn to comfort, that a heart that had been shattered could still learn to love without fear. That image stays with me. A father holding his child without fear, without shame, without the weight of a closed door. James's mother chose to close a door. She chose silence over her son's safety. She chose comfort over love. And that choice haunted James for nearly 30 years. But James made different choices. He chose to face his past. He chose to fight his demons. He chose to open doors rather than close them. And in doing so, he gave his son something his father never gave him. A chance to grow up feeling safe, feeling loved, feeling protected. Some stories don't have happy endings, but James's story had something better. It had a new beginning. I hope this story has helped you see your own life, your emotions, or the people around you through a different lens. I hope it has helped you understand yourself and others a little better. I would love to hear something about you in the comments to get to know you and your story a little more. If you want to share what's on your heart, you can write to the email in my profile. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe. To be notified about the next real-life story, click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Before we end, I want to ask you a few questions. Take a moment to think about them. What do you think about this story? Does James's journey remind you of anything in your own life or in the lives of people you know? Can wounds this deep truly heal? Or do we just learn to live with them? What does healing even mean when someone has been betrayed by the people who should have protected them most? If you were in James's position, would you have confronted your mother? Was there anything to gain from that conversation? Or was it enough just to speak the truth out loud? What would you say to the 7-year-old James, the one standing at the top of the basement stairs, hearing his father call his name? And what would you say to the 39-year-old James who walked into my office, terrified of his own hands? Do you believe that the cycle of abuse can truly be broken? Or does it leave marks that pass down, generation to generation, no matter how hard we try? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Your perspective matters. Your voice matters.